I'm Amy Wyatt. I am the new executive director here at OCCA, and very, very excited to welcome Ashley to our last event. So she is the closing event of our first ever Digital Earth Festival. It's been 5 days of digital adventures, which is very new for us as a conservation organization. Usually we're out and about with our hiking boots, and this time we're at the computer, but we're making everything work, and it's been a lot of fun. And we're very, very excited to have Ashley be the final presentation of the day. She's got some really great stuff for us, and I will actually let her introduce herself a little bit more. But if just logistics wise, if there are any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat, and there will be stopping points that Ashley will call for some questions, and we will start some discussions and facilitate conversation. Till that point though, if you want to leave your microphones muted when she's in the presentation mode, and then when we open it up, then we can all unmute and have a really lively conversation. But if you are like me and you forget what it was you wanted to ask, just pop it in the chat when it comes to you, and we'll make sure that we cover it when we have our interactive conversation at the end. So with no further ado, let's all mute our microphones, hand it over to Ashley to introduce herself and learn about gardening in a warmer world.
All right, thank you, Amy. Well, it's really great to be here, and there will be an opportunity for us all to kind of, so we have a small group, introduce everybody on the call, but my name is Ashley Helmholt. I work with Cornell University's Horticulture section in the School of Integrated Plant Sciences, but I actually am an extension associate. So I work for the Garden-Based Learning Program, which is the entity within that organization that works with basically CCE organizations around the state. We work primarily with horticulture educators, really focused on curriculum and professional development for those educators that are working in communities, doing a lot of similar kinds of hands-on activities and programs like you all do in your community. But in my past, I've really come from the sustainability world. I worked in Savannah, Georgia for 4 years in the sustainability office there. And I've worked previously with national sustainability organizations like National Wildlife Federation and with Earth Force, which is, they're both of those programs were focused on youth. So I'm coming from this kind of environmental education background, but now we're focusing in a little bit more on how gardening really pertains to the bigger sustainability picture. And I think it's a really great topic because right now everybody is like, what can I do in my own sphere of influence? And really gardening is one that a lot of people, from a small pot in their backyard to a bigger garden, can really feel like they're doing something to both improve food security as well as, you know, environmental sustainability. So I think it's just a wonderful time to just reconnect with nature, and I believe that a lot of people are really doing that. And as we've seen across the world, we've seen all these fantastic pictures of places being cleared of smog and pollution, and seeing mountains for the first time in years, and really this kind of call to nature, really reconnecting to nature has been a big part of, I think, one of the only positive parts I think that people are experiencing in this time. And I think Earth Day is a really good time to also remember the connection between our human interactions in our natural world, and how really interconnected we truly are. So I'm just really pleased to be here and talk about this topic, and just share with you some resources that were created a few years ago related to, again, gardening in a warming world. So we're really looking in on gardening as a tool to think about and learn about our local environment, and then share that with others. So this curriculum is really one that was used, has been used primarily with our Master Gardener Volunteer Program. So thank you to David Cox. He invited me to this event today, and we'd love to share this presentation with folks across the state. So thank you again for holding it. I think what's really wonderful, again, about thinking through this topic at this time is that it can, again, connect us back to our own place. And so this is something we do with our Master Gardeners right from the get-go in this presentation, is we ask folks to get a piece of paper and sketch or describe in words your gardening space. This is really an opportunity, again, for us to hear from you all and learn about where you all are at around this concept of systems thinking, and specifically in the context of gardening. So I would just, if you all have gardening spaces, which I'm sure many of you do, um, take a few moments and maybe just share in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself since we're a small group, you can really share some of the things you see in the system of your own personal home garden, just to kind of get us to introduce yourselves. And if you do talk, please just say hello, let me know where you're coming from. Just would love to just get to know who's on the call. So anybody's interested in sharing, I'll personally just share my story really quickly. My little son, who's 2, who might wake up any moment right now, he has been helping me put in a garden, a salad garden in the backyard. And we've just moved into our house last July, so we just built all of our raised beds and have been thinking about how water flows on the site and where we might want to put some rain garden plants. We've been really thinking about, again, the source of good soil and thinking about contamination in our garden that might be here from, this is an older house and an older neighborhood. So I've been thinking about a lot of these different systems pieces that are just in our backyard, kind of thinking about our microclimate and how it affects the backyard space. So that's what we've been doing. That's what I would kind of describe for you all in a kind of a picture of where we're coming from. It's a very small space. So we do not have a big backyard, and first backyard really ever that we've ever owned and been a part of. So if anybody would like to share any kind of similar kind of story about where you're coming from and your place, I'd love to hear it.
I'll go next, I guess. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, who is that? Who is the brave soul? Is that you, Anne?
Yeah, but there was somebody else in there.
I think it was you. We're gonna let you go first.
Give it to me. That's fine. We only do veggies, and we have 6 gardens, 30 by 75 or 70, and we rotate. So we really only have 2 gardens every year, and then we rotate. We're eating out of our freezer now and canned stuff because that's what we want to do, and it's really been handy right now. But that's just where we're coming from, and we've been doing this for about 10 years, so we're getting good at it. We're not there yet, but we're getting there and having a good time. We use weed barrier a lot. We reuse it every year. That helps us a lot in the irrigation-ish parts of the garden that have problems and stuff. So it's pretty much just veggies, and we're pretty happy with it, actually.
Nice.
Fantastic. Mine's super similar to yours, Ashley. I am starting a salad garden, but I'm actually trying to do it inside. I have just moved into a new house and has a large space that I can sort of turn into a greenhouse, and I thought it'd be really cool to have fresh vegetables in February. So, wish me luck.
That's very brave.
Right? Anyone else want to tell us about their garden setup?
I can tell you, I'm Catherine. I purchased my house in 2012, and I started a little hay bale garden right off the bat. And that worked out really well. And then in the same spot, then now I have a more permanent garden. It's got a double fence because I keep the deer out better that way. They ended up breaking down the first fence. It's about 60 by 40, maybe. I also have some chickens that I keep in a yard next to the garden, and then at the end of the season I let the chickens in and let them scratch it up most of the time. And then now I'm just starting a garden in my front field. I have a split property where I have half the acreage on the front field, and then actually my garden is in my front yard because my backyard is too shady. So I just covered it with some cardboard, some corrugated plain cardboard, and staked it down. And so hopefully I'll plant right into that. So I don't have to disturb the soil because I don't till. I believe that the soil structure is really important to keep it intact. And it's some flowers, but mostly vegetables. And it's kind of fun to do it. It's very rewarding, and it's where I go to chill out.
Nice. It sounds like we have a very knowledgeable group on the call, which is going to be great because you all are many of you involved with the Otsego County Conservation Association. I'm kind of curious too if some of you all are volunteers or just interested community members. Love to find that out too.
I am not, but I was part of the Cooperative Extension in Schoharie County before it joined with Otsego County. So yeah, learned a lot there.
Great. Well, thank you. If anybody else wants to chime in, and can you all, if you can all hear me, just say holler in the chat and just make sure somebody mentioned that might be a little hard to hear. So I'll try to speak up if anybody has any questions. But anything else, go ahead and speak up as well during the call.
Hi, this is Florence Carnahan, and I used to live in Otsego County. I now live in Schenectady County, but I keep in touch with several people in the ACA group. And we moved from a rural area with a garden that was about 50 by 100 feet, and I now have a 1/10 of an acre, and part of that has a house on it. So I have a very small garden, and I had to bring in dirt that was organic. And we're enlarging it again this year with another 3 by 3 foot bed and 3 by 2 foot bed. So it's not very big, but we have berries, blueberries and strawberries, and I've got asparagus, rhubarb as my perennials, and I planted my onion plants and garlic last fall, and onion plants just now. And I'll be buying plants from local nurseries. We're under, stay at home just like anybody else. And the nurseries around here are putting together curbside and delivery so that people can garden around here. But it's really still pretty cold, just like it is where you are over in, and I've bought things from the local extension here, but it looks like there won't be any plant sale this year because of the stay-at-home orders.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's probably something on everybody's mind, how what we're doing in the garden connects to what's going on in our state and world right now. And we're lucky, at least in our state, that we do have some access to some materials right now. But for the most part, from my understanding of ag and markets right now, the regulations are saying that only food-based plants are allowed to be cultivated, meaning, but I think they're still able to sell what's remaining in their nurseries right now as far as ornamentals. I'm a little unsure of, but thank you for clarifying a little bit about that. I know a lot of plant sales are really affected by this. So yeah, that's definitely going to affect the world of gardening for sure. At least food-based plants are still allowed to be cultivated and sold. So that's a good thing.
So actually just a little update here, and I don't know whether it's the same here as it is elsewhere. The Cooperative Extension does have a food plant sale, and you can order online and then get in line and pick it up curbside.
That's great.
The nurseries here must be considered essential businesses, and they have the perennials and annuals, bushes, fruit trees, and they will deliver them to people.
Okay.
And they're just adding them online just now this week.
Okay. That helps me understand a little bit. It's hard to keep up with all. I know everybody's probably in the same state of the regulations are changing and going back and forth. So it's kind of, all I know is from the CC side, definitely the food-based plants are allowed. And so we'll definitely, I think your local CC office will be sharing that kind of resource with you all. So that's a good thing. Well, yeah, thank you, everybody. Is anybody else on the call that's really wants to share really quickly about their gardening background and experience in this topic? Well, there's lots of other opportunities for us to talk and chat as we keep going, but I think it's a really good starting point. And because this is such a really knowledgeable group, from what I can tell on our call here, a lot of this might be a little bit of a review. But what's nice about this, both this PowerPoint and the related manual that we have to go along with it as a curriculum, is that you all could use it in your education or volunteer activities to educate others. So specifically talking about master gardeners, when we work with those folks, we are encouraging them to do presentations in their communities and we'd really love, again, from a peer learning perspective, which is a lot of what we do in the Master Gardener program and in garden-based learning. We really want people to be learning from people that, you know, are their peers. And that's really the best way that we learn as adults. We really learn best by building on our own knowledge and hearing from others in our community who are our peers. And not necessarily just the facts and figures piece, which there's a lot of that in here, but there's also a lot of, again, relating back to how do we teach this material in our communities, and how do we educate our family and friends, which is really an important way to get the word out about a lot of this. And again, I think this is where the learning objectives really come in, is kind of just anchoring us all in our experience, what we have as experience around gardening and in climate change, but also really thinking about how does it specifically affect us right now and at our specific place, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road for a lot of people. And for anybody who might have family members or had professional experiences where, you know, you've worked with people that might not be as knowledgeable or might not have the same opinions about climate change, it's really important to have these examples of local hands-on examples like gardening to give people relatable experiences. And, you know, that's something that I'm learning a lot about, and in my work and in some of my past work, you know, that really, again, relating back to what's relevant to people in their own lives. And then really identifying the ways you personally in your personal life can mitigate and adapt to climate impacts, but also thinking about, again, some of these bigger picture statewide efforts that are going on that I'd love to share and talk with you as a group, because again, your group is very, very knowledgeable about these topics. It seems like, at least on the gardening front too, we can certainly be involving new partners and organizations in the projects we're working on statewide. So I'd love to get a discussion going on that. So this is, again, another question, another kind of icebreaker for us that I'd love to get the group thinking about, again, from a perspective of systems thinking. Obviously, what do you see when you look at a forest, right? We see trees, we also see the plants, soil, water, birds, but putting all those independent pieces into a place don't necessarily make a forest, right? And when I talk about and think about sustainability in a forest context, to me, it's really about the relationships among these interconnected elements. And I think some of you are probably familiar with mycelium running. There's a great documentary now out about how fungi kind of interact and work in a complex system to support forest ecosystems. The same thing with several species of trees are actually, there's lots of studies around how they communicate with each other when they're under stress. So there's a lot of these kinds of newer perspectives on how our systems in forests and ecosystems work together. But I think the same thing, and we often don't talk about it in this way, but our gardens and our homes are definitely a part of those systems and definitely interconnected. And I also like to add, you know, the human element to this. And I think we've, unfortunately, in a lot of our culture, have separated ourselves out and said, this is nature, this is not. A lot of my background in urban planning and environmental studies has been around that very, very opposite thing, which is the interconnectedness of our human environments and our natural environments, and how much they really are interconnected to our health. So that I'll bring that perspective into this presentation as well. And I think gardening is just a fantastic place to reconnect between that human health perspective and the environmental health perspective. So I won't go into great detail about this, but I think, again, this is a great tool, a great question and icebreaker if you were to educate someone in your community about this topic. So I think this is, again, another great example, giving people examples from our own experience. How could systems thinking and the perspective of systems thinking really be used in the context of one particular gardening issue, right? So if anybody's had a garden, you've sure had pest management failure going on in your garden. It's almost like a given that we're all going to have the issues related to pest management. And this is part of our Unit 1, again, benefits of system thinking for sustainable gardening in our curriculum that you can read more in depth. But in this example, really we're talking about, again, how does changing just one thing in the garden affect all the other things that are related to that issue? In this case, talking about pesticides. If you use a pesticide to get rid of one particular pest, right? Some crops will do well, but over time, even as those crops decrease in population, there'll be another population that's in the system that will increase. and potentially cause more crop damage. So I think this is actually a pretty good example, again, working with gardeners, master gardeners, because it's such an important way to think about how you can't separate any one element of the garden out from another. So again, going back to the curriculum that Amy shared with you, there's a great activity in that curriculum called the Habits of a System Thinker, and it really goes over that, again, the benefits of that systems thinking perspective. It might be a great resource for you all to check out when thinking about, again, how would you educate others on this topic? So I'll definitely just be referring to that curriculum at several points. And when we do this in person with educators and with master gardeners, we definitely have them work through some of these curriculum pieces, but I just wanted to kind of make you aware of the different ways we communicate how this looks in a garden context. And it's certainly a really wonderful, again, contextual piece for thinking about how do we concentrate on not just one specific element. We're often taught that, and I think in a lot of our schooling to kind of narrow our focus to just one discipline. And what I've found in my own professional life, and also in my work in gardening and environmental education, is that it's really hard for me to disconnect one piece from all of the others. So in a specific example, again, like pest management, this principle of organization is focused on the key idea of observing relationships, right? So what's preserved in a garden area is not individual plants or organisms, but a complex web of relationships between them. And while this might seem very basic for a lot of us in the conservation or sustainability world, again, it's not the way we're really taught, and much of our, even our elementary and high school education really misses this component of getting out in nature and observing. And I think that's one of the key things we can bring to people at this time is this awareness of taking the time that they might have with this pause that we have in New York State, and really becoming more aware of the observations we find out in nature. It not only is beneficial for our mental wellness and health, it's also really great for us understanding our systems sustainability. So again, thinking through how do we intentionally observe and document changes in our garden landscapes and notice those relationships among the changes. And that's a powerful tool for working with kids. It's a powerful tool for working with adults. So as you can see here, this is a great graphic. I love this one, showing all those different kind of levels of interaction in a garden space. So next, I'd really love for us to, again, think about what you shared with us at the beginning and consider ways to apply systems thinking to your own garden. So I know, again, this is a group of probably very interested folks in this topic, given you're watching this presentation, but starting small and finding that, again, delight in that process of discovery, I think is a great starting point, not just for folks that are very interested in gardening, but also for anybody who's new. I've worked with a lot of new gardeners too, people just starting, and it's amazing when you talk to somebody who's, maybe 80 and has never gardened before and has that awe of discovery in the gardening space as well. So maybe beginning really simply with an introspective or meditative observational experience in the garden. So sitting outside, walking around your garden spaces, really just getting a sense of the look, touch, and taste of the garden. And then, of course, listening and smelling in the garden. And then really thinking about, how does my garden support a thriving system in my own small space that I have? So that's really where we're going with this first part of our curriculum. And there's so many tools, obviously, for gardeners to do this. And again, if you're an avid gardener, this is something you probably have already done. But I love, again, for new gardeners or even people, I consider myself always a new gardener, even though I've been gardening in different spaces for 10 years. Every space is different, so there's always room for discovery. I've started in community gardens, helping them to design spaces, and learned a ton about what I should and should not do. So one of the first and best techniques that I love to do around observation is journaling and also designing. I come from an urban planning background and urban designing background, so design and looking at maps makes a lot of sense to me and really helps me to understand my system. And you can do a number of different types of maps, including the maps of things like where water moves on the site, as well as a site assessment of where sun is on your site, soil samples of different parts of the soil. It's really seeing what your soil quality is throughout your site. There's a number of ways that you can describe and take photographs, sketches, listings, as well as calendars, which is a great way. There's a lot of great, wonderful apps out there for gardening. But again, ways to remind you when to do certain things, but also for you to document what's going on and what changes over time in your garden. And then, of course, cataloging your garden. There's some amazing, really wonderful tools out there online that you can use for documenting nature in your garden. And then also that helps you to notice different things related to, again, climate change that might be happening. Things like bloom dates changing, frost dates changing, that kind of a thing. So again, mapping, calendars, cataloging, those are all really wonderful tools. And there's a number of resources in the curriculum that we use around knowing your garden system that are in the facilitator's notebook that was shared with you in the chat. And again, this is kind of that next step after you think about sketching your gardens in the first place and adding details and really creating a base map that's more descriptive of the bigger system that your garden's a part of. So in a normal session where we're not kind of at a distance, I would have you all getting you guys together and have you actually kind of list out some of those ways you yourself have documented that. But I think right now I'll just ask you all to share. Again, you can unmute and just share what in your local community, in your local county, you've noticed as changes in your garden space, maybe over the last, again, depending on how long you've gardened, over the last 5 to 10 years. What things have you noticed that might be a little bit different? And just share with the group. Again, based around this idea of how does climate change affected your part of New York? So I'd love to get folks back on the call and just unmute and talk a little bit.
Well, I can start. It's Catherine. Because we had a very interesting early season. I've already started quite a lot of seeds, and I've even put them a little bit out in my mini greenhouse, although I've had to bring them back in because we got the cold weather again at night. But that's one thing that I definitely am noticing is that our first or last frost date used to be the end of May or even early June, and now I really think that that's moved up probably a couple of weeks in the past 5 years or so. So just adjusting the seed dates, to account for that, because now it seems maybe we're going to have a longer growing season, whereas sometimes the growing seasons, especially for things like tomatoes and peppers, were really short, almost too short.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big one. I think that people notice first is the changing frost dates and kind of end of winter, beginning of winter times. Yeah, definitely.
It's Florence. And the thing that I've noticed, you said over the years, and I noticed this when we lived in Otsego County, the number of weeds that I had never seen before. It was just like an explosion of weeds. And I've got different ones here. But not only weeds in the garden, but coming up through the grass. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that, but it was phenomenal. Just that, the difference in the numbers of weeds. And you spend a lot of time dealing with those if you want to have a garden.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think also invasives, weeds and invasives, there's a real advantage in climate change for some of these species that are already kind of take advantage of kind of any space in your garden that's not completely occupied by plants. So that's definitely something we talked about in a presentation back at Cornell recently. There's a lot of work being done in the Northeast around what are the changing invasive species that are occurring because of climate change, and some of them moving from the south further up north. So that's a great point. I think it applies to weeds too. Yeah.
Are they all bad?
No, not always. No, I think that's something we have to kind of think about in a different way, is really thinking through there are definitely some weeds and invasive species that are problematic, right? There's also some benefits, right? Enhancing your gardening success that might come as a result of climate change. Not everything is necessarily for a gardener. From that perspective, you might have more range of different kinds of plants that you can plant. And I think one example, for instance, is sweet potatoes. They do grow in New York State, but I think they're growing better recently because they need a longer growing season. But there's a lot of examples of that, and I could certainly point you to some resources, or again, specifically around invasive species, if you want to learn more about those topics. It's not an area I have a ton of expertise in, but definitely we have a ton here at Cornell, specifically on this topic.
There's one observation that we've made over the years, and nothing has changed in our property topographically or anything like that, but incredibly destructive winds. They seem much more powerful, and like right today, for instance, for sure, but just ripping stuff up. It's just amazing. And I don't know whether that's climate change or not. It's just, it's really hard to deal with. I mean, tomato towers or cages that get blown over and fences that get blown down, and it's an ongoing hassle. And I would agree with Florence about the plants, invasive plants, but also insects that we have, are moving in and finding a nice home for the north.
Yep. Those are definitely real challenges, and especially if they're insects you're not used to, can cause some serious challenges in the garden. I do think there's a lot of extremes. I think that's one thing that I've learned from some of the presentations by folks in the horticulture section here is that that some of the things we're seeing are more sporadic, I guess, like climate patterns. So whereas global warming definitely is a phrase that's used a lot, and it's definitely, as an overall climate pattern, very consistent. There's also these kind of events, right? These kind of extreme events that happen as well due to the changes in the jet stream that occur because of climate change. So those are things that are happening at a worldwide level that make it hard to really see that bigger overall warming perspective that's definitely happening. But that also creates that kind of uncertainty about when, again, the seasons are going to change and when those last frost or snow events are going to happen. That really is, I think, a big part of some of the science that's coming out about the changes that we're seeing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I just wanted to get, if there's any other thoughts on the group about what you've noticed, we'll bring these up as we keep going and as we talk about some of the changes that the science tells us about climate change related to our own personal gardens. But I think the big one, I don't know if as many people talked about this, more rainfall. In New York State, more rainfall is a big part of the changes here. And specifically what I've noticed is just there's more large rain events, right? So it might not be necessarily like spread out over time, but these large rain events are really the thing that has increased over time, because this kind of causes more of these kind of flash flood issues, definitely sewer overflow issues, and it really disrupts our local waterways, and that's a big concern for a lot of locations around the state. And obviously, cooperative extension, this is a big part of what we do, right? It's a big part of our mission, educating stakeholders about the intensifying challenge and helping citizens implement the strategies that they need to adapt to climate change. So that's part of why I'm here today, but also really wanting to hear from a group of folks who are interested in educating about this topic, that we have an even longer presentation that prepares you as an educator, potentially if some of you are master gardeners in your county, or even if you're not, if you're an educator that is volunteering in other organizations, how can you use this information to really help people, again, connect to the science, but in a way that helps them connect to their own stories about how this affects their lives. And that to me is where it really, I think, makes a big difference. So thank you for sharing your observations. And if anybody else has anything else, just pipe up, or you can also raise your hand and just tell me if you want to talk a little bit. So this is the way I kind of, in the presentation, I wanted to get into a little bit of so that was unit 1 and 2, talking about systems thinking, and again, some of those ways that we observe in our garden. Unit 3 and the curriculum is all around climate change basics. And so this might be a review for some of you, but again, I think the big takeaway is that when you're educating about this or just learning about this, that weather is a state of the atmosphere at a specific time and place, and that short-term variations happen, again, like we talked about in our observations. And it's referred to, you know, from cloudiness to humidity to precipitation and temperature. But when we're talking about the climate, you know, it's not just what will it be like today, but really more those long-term patterns we're seeing in the local environment. So the long-term weather conditions in a particular place are really, again, where that period of about 30 plus years in a specific place is where we talk about climate and climate change. So these elements include precipitation, temperature, and humidity as well, but also kind of those averages that we talked about, again, the last frost in spring to help plan when to transplant plants, as well as the first frost dates in the fall. Those kinds of patterns are really where we see those changes. And I think where I think people who do garden can relate really in a very hands-on way to how this is affecting them. So the period between the last frost in spring and the first frost in the fall, you probably know, is called the freeze-free period or the frost-free days. And so this map gives you an example of that. And every county in the state with CCE has specific guidelines around, again, what you can plant in those frost-free dates and when to plant. But again, that's getting harder and harder. And because these things are changing, you know, we have to keep up our different manuals and things with you know, new information around this that, you know, as it's changed. As you can see in the first picture there, right? This is the daily maximum temperature. So this is looking at, again, a snapshot in time. And then there's also the date of the first fall frost in the second picture. And all of this is from the Northeast Regional Climate Center at Cornell University. So if you want really specific data, also NOAA has a lot of this great data as well. And that's really where you can find the most up-to-date information on how the climate's changed locally. The other really great tool here that I just recommend for folks is this growing degree day calculator. And this is incredibly important, obviously, for commercial growers. The calculation of growing degree days, or the heat accumulated during each growing season, is a formal way to estimate timing of growth of an organism. Things like bud break, flowering, as well as eggs of a particular pest are going to be related to this number. So it's a great example, again, of measuring the weather in the garden or landscape, and a more accurate method of estimating the timing of events than the calendar method will be. So for instance, just to give you an example, Japanese beetles don't just wake up one morning and say, oh my gosh, it's June 15th already, time to get out. So the emergence of certain pests and certain organisms is really, they're determined by these growing degree days. So in the context of climate change, this earlier appearance might mean in spring it's warm and those growing degree days accumulate earlier and appear later when it's cool. So just to give you an example. So you don't have to do the math, and you've got it right here, which is fantastic. You can put in your planting date. You can find out, again, the lower and upper base temperature for growth of an organism. And it's, again, this is at the Northeast US, Northeastern, a specific growing degree calculator for the Northeastern US at climatesmartfarming.org/tools. So this is, again, kind of the website. And this website, just for everybody's information, they recently lost some of their funding. So the website in its entirety might not be there forever, but it's going to be transferring to other sites, including ours with the garden-based learning program. Some of those tools and things I shared with you will be in a different spot. But again, these tools are very important for farmers and gardeners. So this is, again, you probably, if you're a gardener, you know the hardiness map, but it's an important tool, again, with educating people. With the growing degree days focus, again, and the current weather of the US, the USDA hardiness zone map really uses those decades of past minimum average winter temperatures to divide the North America into these 13 zones. And these plant hardiness zones are what you find on the back of, you know, your seed packets and the little tags on your perennial plants, just so that you can understand, again, where they'll survive winters if you want to garden with them. So a lot of folks, this is not new information, but again, it's another climate tool we can use. And obviously, I think the biggest climate, when we're educating on the climate change basics to others, what I really like to talk about with, especially with people who might have a background in this, but even if you don't, there's some wording around this that is really important to getting the message across to people who might disagree with this. And this is really, I think, really key right now when we're talking about this kind of age of folks not believing in certain scientific facts and figures. There's a lot of research that's been done on specific wording and metaphors that you can use that help people to understand the concepts in a basic way. we're talking about the greenhouse effect, that trapping of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This kind of a diagram is one you've probably seen before, where it kind of shows you that greenhouse effect where the trapping of that infrared radiation is caused. But what a great way to present it to others, and when talking to people who might disagree with this, is really to talk about it like a heat trapping blanket. That's the specific wording that's been researched across the country in a study of folks from many different political backgrounds. And that specific wording is what's worked with the most people in explaining this concept of the atmosphere and the buildup of these greenhouse gases forms this heat trapping blanket like it would in your own home if you had a very thick blanket on, you know. So I think that's just to give you, again, another metaphor to use with people that might help people to relate and connect to it in a way that's very relevant. And I think, again, I just really encourage folks to talk about it in the words around climate change. And sometimes global warming can, again, if somebody's weather happen to have a cold year, they're going to be like, climate change, not real. Or global warming, not real. But I think the climate change is this bigger overall pattern, right? And that the incoming solar energy and the buildup of these gases is really a long-term process that affects the overall weather systems. And that is the key message. And I won't go into a lot more detail about the greenhouse effect. If there's anybody who wants any more specific information on how to communicate that, please get in touch. But this is another great slide, and one I like to share as well, because coming from the sustainability background, I think we hear a lot about, again, CO2, but we don't hear as much about methane or nitrous oxide, even ozone and water vapor as other contributors to the greenhouse effect. And why that's important, really methane is a huge contributor, and it comes from a lot of our local landfills, right? So when organic matter breaks down, methane is released. And that's an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, almost 20 times more powerful than CO2. Whereas most people talk about CO2, I think it's important to mention the others, especially because as gardeners, we can also keep some of our organic waste and compost it at home. And that's just one way that we can, again, kind of build up our organic soil matter and actually sort of trap some of the carbon back in the soil. Nitrous oxide, and that piece is actually a really important piece for gardeners to consider as well, because a lot of people add fertilizer at the beginning of the season specifically to their lawns, and excess nitrogen is also a contributor to greenhouse gases. So again, kind of the timing of that or reducing that input as far as climate change is an important one for gardeners to know about, and landscapers for sure. So let's see here, go to the next slide. If there's any questions, please raise your hand. There's like a little hand raising tool, I believe, but if it's not there, go ahead and put something in the chat and just stop me if at any time. This is all in our curriculum, and again, there's a lot of great videos about it that are even better than what I'm talking about right now. There's Bill Nye videos, there's some fantastic, really basic videos for different audiences at different ages. The Climate Learning Network specifically has a wonderful, very clear and concise video series on this topic. And I just encourage you to look at the other resources we have. So really, again, this is, there's another handout in our curriculum called What Happens in New York State When the Climate Changes, in the facilitator's notebook that was shared with you. But I think the main takeaway on that is that the scientific data is really clear, that the climate change is happening at an accelerating rate since 1850, essentially since the beginning of the industrial age. And that the data shows this, that the 3 decades from 1983 to 2012 were the warmest 30-year period of the last 1,400 years. So that's from the International Panel on Climate Change specifically. So knowing this, and actually knowing what we're seeing around the world right now with the lack of CO2 being contributed right now with this pause, really, I'm really interested to see if any of these indicators, any of the things change at all based on the blip of the time that we're in, when we really are pausing a lot of that contribution to climate change. A lot of these things that we see, again, there's such an interconnected system of, when ice melts and how it affects the jet stream and how that affects our local weather. That's such a complex system, it's often hard for people to see how it really affects them in a very personal way. But I think this does a pretty good job of sharing some of the ways that people in their local community might see the changing environment. Again, spring coming earlier, species migrating, I think some of the things you mentioned, and even along our coastal areas here in New York State, seeing the sea level rising. These are just some of the ways New York State's going to see those changes happen. And again, lots of data in here, but I think the big overall trend that you're seeing in these graphs is this temperature difference, right? This kind of average line of temperature increasing in all seasons, which is important for people to see. It's important for people to see the raw data on that. And the winter's warming, I think, is the clearest one of these graphs for folks to really get. So those dashed lines, again, being that average linear trend for the state. So just to give you a few more other talking points, and I'll try to keep speeding up so we can have like a little discussion about the positive things that we're doing and what you all can do in your own communities. But I think that average annual temperature statewide has risen about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970, just to give you a little stat that might be something you can, and the winter warming is exceeding 4.4 degrees Fahrenheit increase. So that's a pretty big difference. That equals about 0.25 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1900. And the average temperatures have increased across, the annual average across the state has also increased. And I actually, this is, I think one of the best, easiest to understand ways you can see how this affects us regionally. Again, as the world has warmed, this warming has triggered these other climate changes that are more reflective in these periods of kind of intense weather that we're seeing. And as you can see, our region, that very heavy precipitation is the big one. And I mentioned that before, and I think you all mentioned some changes you've seen in your local climate, but this is the one that's most going to affect us. And this, I think, is important for a lot of reasons, because it's affecting how I think about and how our programs think about what's most important to teach others about right now, and how can we really make a difference. So over the last 50 years, right, if we're seeing the 71% increase in these very heavy precipitation events, that affects our water quality, that affects our sewer systems, and that affects all kinds of things related to extreme weather events. And so while it might not be the same as what's going on in California, there's something, you know, on a policy level and in local levels that we can do about these kind of high temperatures, as well as floods that occur with heavy downpours. That also could be balanced with some drought periods too. So if you have a lot of really heavy rain events, but then droughts in between, that's also not necessarily a good thing for our gardens and landscapes and at local environments. So, you know, just want to take a moment and pause. If anybody has any questions about some of these stats and figures, again, these are just kind of going over the basics for us to date. But if you do have any questions, I do think that the big thing to remember is the precipitation's increasing, especially in the winter, and less precipitation in the summer. And then between 1958 and 2010, the amount of precipitation falling in very heavy events, what I talk about here in this graphic, is the 70% number. So there's a question. Looks like there might be a question. So why did the Northeast receive the highest change in precipitation? That's one question. I think I could probably, I think my understanding and what I've read about, again, the changes that have kind of occurred from the melting of ice and kind of the jet stream and kind of how that affects. I know that a lot of that effect on some of those really intense winter events is related to that. And I think that that might have something to do with it. That's a really great question, and I could maybe get back to you about that, because that, I think, has more to do, again, with kind of the relationship between the ocean and that specific region and the jet stream. But again, I think that what happens is the ice that's melting has a pretty big effect on the oceans and the ocean's ability to, again, regulate that temperature and regulate those major climate events. So that's my understanding of it, at least. But it is pretty extreme, so I can certainly try to find out if there's a little bit more explanation of why that specific impact is affecting us. And I think, again, going to the Cornell Northeast Regional Climate page might give you some, again, more background on that. This is an interesting document as well. I think the observed increase in frost-free season length. So again, I think this is where we might not be impacted as much as some of those, again, Western regions that are seeing a bigger difference. And that could be good. I think there's some modification again for counties that are near lakes and on the Great Lakes, because they're not as that really helps to moderate the temperature increases. So in some ways we're lucky in some of those climate change impacts. And some of our cities, if you might have heard, Buffalo has really touted that it's a climate refuge city and that it won't be as impacted as other cities across the US. There's, some of these changes aren't necessarily as extreme as other places in the country. And again, this kind of affects how confidently we can rely on the frameworks that we have to plan and achieve success in garden settings, but also just understanding how it impacts our local environment. So it's not all bad news, but I think that, again, the signs of climate change and impacts in garden systems, this difference in hardiness zone is probably where you'll see it in that kind of very hands-on way. Again, what you can grow might change in your region, and that's a very specific kind of, county by county, as you can see, map. So you might want to really check into that in your local gardening efforts too, just so that people understand this has changed. So those increases in frost-free season length and changes in hardiness zone really go together. And so definitely something to know. These are just a few of those signs. Again, we've talked a lot about this, but some of those signs that climate change has impacted garden systems and landscapes that you might be working in, those earlier leaf and bloom events and extinctions are also a lot higher in animals than in the plants that we're seeing. Frost and freeze damage, that's a big one for gardeners and for farmers, frankly. I know a lot of like the fruiting trees specifically that might bud out or might bloom early and then have a late frost because of this erratic weather pattern has really impacted the apple industry in our state. I know that for sure. Invasive species I mentioned are more responsive to the changes. They're really adapting quickly, and sometimes we can't always adapt as quickly to them. And then the short-lived insect pests have those, again, increased population growth. Some things, new, maybe beneficial species might be coming northwards. And then of course, pollen, which everybody who has allergies like me knows can be problematic for a lot of people. So these are just some of the common ecological changes, but there's plenty of other details again in that Climate Smart Gardening course book, Unit 3, Climate Change Basics section, and then some of those observation signs of climate change impacts. And that's specifically, if you want to look into seeing these kinds of changes in gardens, page 14 of that booklet will give you that guidance. So in conclusion, we're kind of getting to the end here, and I just want to wrap up by kind of getting back to what can we do as individuals, what can we do as community members and volunteers to make sure we're sharing the best information we can. And certainly nobody can be an expert on all of this, and we're all learning and adapting our information to the changing scenario it's really changing very frequently. And I think especially in this time, it's so important to really have like a checklist when we're looking at reliable sources. This is something that is really important for all of our volunteers in our system who are working with community members all the time, making sure they have, again, who's the authority, who's the author behind a point of view, what's the purpose of the source and the publication, where was it published, and is it a peer-reviewed source specifically? I think Google Scholar is not a bad place to do searching for really, again, those kind of peer-reviewed scientific studies. The relevance, again, is it relevant to your scope of what you're talking about with people? And then the date of the publication, that's a really important one, given how these things change so frequently. Knowing it's a recent publication is really key. And then documentation. So if somebody's writing an article and not documenting sources, that's going to be a real key to knowing that that's probably coming from a different place than maybe the science that we're talking about here. So, and just for a little definition here too as well, when we're talking about some of these different potential positive things we can do in our communities, mitigation is like the reducing of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's something a lot of folks from local governments to homeowners are doing, from again, getting solar or renewable energy sources, or reducing their emissions from their cars and vehicles and fleets. But adaptation is really something probably, we do a little bit more of in the garden. Again, we're adapting to those actual and expected climate changes. And we do a little bit of mitigation too, I think, from the perspective of, again, planting certain plants that are going to benefit from the increased temperatures, the increased annual precipitation events, and planting more larger woody plants and herbaceous species, but specifically adapted to some of these changes. And I think that's an important one for us to keep in mind, that we can do both in the garden, and that we're really kind of on the leading edge of ways we can help others in your community take steps, positive steps in this direction. So in the notebook that I mentioned, the manual that we talked about, there's a climate-friendly sustainable gardening audit. And this is just the first step, right? This is a very good educational tool, but these are all things you can do in your own garden to really see, how am I meeting up to kind of the systems thinking, sustainable gardening standard. So the different areas that it covers includes organic material waste management, soil health, nutrient management, water management, pollinator protection, and then garden design specifically around plant selection and equipment. So these are all areas where you can have both a mitigation perspective in there as well as a adaptation perspective. And we're only building these resources. This is really, like I mentioned, a good first step to get that basic knowledge, but we're hoping to build more in-depth webinars on each of these topics in the coming years to help master gardeners and others in our community gain those kind of skills that they need. So this is just a quote from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is just a really good way of thinking about, again, the role of our volunteers and community members and connecting that scientific knowledge from a place like a cooperative extension system to what they can do in their own community around disaster risk reduction. There's just so much citizen science that could be tapped into, and I think the local gardening impulse right now is so strong that I think it's a great place to start for a lot of people to reconnect to this kind of experience. So I'm just going to share a few examples from our work here at Cornell. The Master's Climate Stewards Program is a new initiative with the Atkinson Center, which is our sustainability center on campus, and with Sea Grant, which focuses mostly on water and water resources throughout the state. And what's great about this is that it's really focused on using a tool that's already available called the Climate Smart Communities Initiative to connect various different kinds of action projects and volunteer projects that communities can do to help their local governments achieve those goals. And so again, utilizing kind of the extension of our CCE system and our volunteers to take action on some of these issues. So these are some of those climate smart community pieces that might have a relationship, again, to gardening. So we're working with this specific effort to be able to connect and hopefully connect our master gardeners to some new resources available on climate smart initiatives. So we do a lot that could be really impactful to these communities. Just to give you an example, there's a lot of potential work that we're hoping to build around, again, kind of green infrastructure, and there's a lot of great resources within horticulture specifically around this topic that's used by a lot of municipalities, but could also be used by our local, by more of a gardening community as well. So another program we run is the Seed to Supper program, which works with low budget gardeners to get them started with gardening. Again, that's more of a food systems perspective, but it's still, and this time especially, an area where we can build resilience in our communities and kind of reduce our the footprint of our food in our communities, as well as just build our food security. So those are just two examples of projects that are ongoing, and it might be a way that we can get involved. This is a new one as well, the Food Forest Trial Garden program, which is focused on some of our other courses we have through the horticulture program, specifically around utilizing more perennial plants and forest kind of systems thinking in our gardening design. So we're going to be kind of getting into some of these topics in more depth from the Gardening in the Warming World curriculum, and really having folks actually implement some demonstration gardens in places where we have CCE gardens throughout the state to be able to give the public a real hands-on tool for thinking about resilience in gardening. So there's so much I'd love to talk about and get into in more depth, but I just wanted to encourage you to look at your own personal community and do some vulnerability and asset mapping. So really looking at what are some of those vulnerabilities to climate change that we have in our specific local community, and then what are the real benefits and potential strengths we have in our individuals and associations and institutions and physical spaces that can contribute to us taking next steps in our own community work around climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this is just a tool, the Climate Explorer through NOAA. There's a link that I'll share at the end, but this is a great way, again, to map out your community, see where there's economic maybe vulnerability as well as environmental vulnerability like flooding and other issues, and then kind of comparing that again to some of the strengths in your community to find out where are those gaps, how can you make a difference. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you talk about this topic with other gardeners and other community members and really help them understand how it applies to their personal lives. And I hope you learned a little bit about those learning objectives to be a peer educator and really become familiar with how this applies to our state and ways you can mitigate it in your own personal garden. So thank you again, and let's open it up to